when a freezing billionaire CEO asked a struggling single dad to name the best part of his night, she had her checkbook ready. But his actual answer completely broke her icy exterior and changed both of their lives forever.
The rain did not fall so much as it attacked the city, a relentless, punishing deluge that turned the cracked, pothole-riddled asphalt of 4th Street into a rushing, muddy river. Inside Eddie's 24-hour diner, the atmosphere was a stark, jarring contrast to the violent storm raging just beyond the glass. It was a pocket of stale, stagnant warmth, a sanctuary smelling eternally of burned coffee, industrial bleach, and the faint, sweet memory of cherry pie. Arthur stood behind the long, speckled laminate counter, a damp rag in his right hand, moving with the practiced, mechanical rhythm of a man who was profoundly, fundamentally exhausted. The flickering neon sign in the front window cast alternating flashes of harsh crimson and sickly blue across his face, highlighting the deep, bruised purple shadows beneath his eyes and the sharp lines of a jaw that hadn't seen a razor in 2 days. This was the graveyard shift, the quiet purgatory suspended between midnight and 6 in the morning, a necessary, grueling sacrifice at the altar of survival. As a single father, these solitary, lonely hours were his only reliable lifeline. While he methodically wiped down the sticky salt shakers and refilled the glass sugar dispensers, his mother was asleep in their cramped, drafty apartment across town, hopefully with his 7-year-old daughter, Mia, tucked safely beneath her star-patterned quilt. Mia was his entire universe, a bright, wildly inquisitive child obsessed with astronauts, rocket ships, and the mysteries of the solar system, whose innocent, gap-toothed smile was the only thing keeping Arthur from collapsing entirely under the crushing weight of overdue electric bills, rising rent, and constant gnawing worry. He scrubbed aggressively at a stubborn, dried coffee ring on the counter, the rhythmic, high-pitched squeak of the rag the only sound competing with the low hum of the ancient, vibrating refrigerators and the torrential drumming of the rain against the plate glass. The sudden, frantic, almost violent jingle of the brass door chime shattered the quiet monotony of the diner's interior. A harsh gust of freezing wind whipped inside, carrying with it a spray of icy rainwater and the deafening roar of the storm, before the heavy glass door was slammed shut by a trembling, desperate hand. Arthur looked up slowly from his work, his rag pausing mid-circle on the laminate. Standing in the brightly lit entryway, dripping a steadily growing puddle of dark water onto the faded, checkered linoleum floor, was a woman who looked like she had just been shipwrecked in the middle of a metropolitan city. She was wearing what had clearly once been a breathtaking, custom-tailored, floor-length emerald silk evening gown, a garment meant for velvet carpets and flashbulbs, now plastered transparently to her skin and ruined entirely by thick mud and relentless rainwater. Her impossibly expensive designer heels were soaked through, her carefully styled, intricate hair was plastered against her pale cheeks in wet, chaotic, tangled strands, and she was shivering so violently that her teeth were visibly and audibly chattering. This was Victoria Sterling, a name whispered with a potent mixture of reverence, envy, and sheer terror in the city's highest, most exclusive corporate towers. As the uncompromising CEO of a multi-billion-dollar tech empire, she was universally known for her ruthless precision, her impenetrable emotional composure, and her absolute unapologetic dominance in boardrooms. But right now, stripped entirely of her massive security detail, her frantic personal assistants, and her armored, flawless public facade, she was just a stranded, terrified woman whose sleek $500,000 Maybach had unceremoniously died in a heavily flooded intersection a mile down the road. Victoria hugged her bare arms tightly around her chest, icy water pooling rapidly at her feet, and instinctively braced her mind for the inevitable assault. She was deeply accustomed to the exhausting mechanics of her fame and wealth, immediately preparing for the wide, greedy eyes of recognition, the frantic fumbling for a smartphone camera, or the sycophantic gasps of manufactured awe. But Arthur didn't gasp, he didn't widen his eyes in shock, and he certainly didn't scramble to find a phone. He just looked at her, his expression a steady mixture of mild surprise and deep, weary, uncomplicated empathy. Without uttering a single word, Arthur tossed his damp rag into a gray plastic bus tub beneath the counter. He turned purposefully, grabbing a thick, slightly faded gray fleece jacket from a brass hook on the back wall, his own oversized jacket kept specifically for the bitter nights when the diner's heater failed. Approaching her slowly to signal his absolute harmlessness, he didn't ask if she was the famous Victoria Sterling or what disaster had befallen her. He simply unfolded the thick fleece and draped it gently over her violently trembling shoulders. The heavy jacket completely swallowed her slight frame, smelling faintly of cheap laundry detergent and old diner grease, but to Victoria it was gloriously dry. "Rough night out there," Arthur murmured softly, his voice a comforting baritone devoid of pretense. Before Victoria could respond, he retreated to the counter. She slowly followed, sliding onto a squeaky red vinyl stool. Almost instantly, Arthur slid a heavy, chipped ceramic mug across the laminate surface until it rested in front of her. Thick steam curled upward from the black coffee, carrying the welcoming aroma of cheap diner brew. "Drink that. It's not fancy, but it's hot," Arthur said flatly, grabbing a paring knife to meticulously slice lemons. Victoria wrapped her freezing fingers around the hot ceramic, letting the heat seep into her aching bones. She looked at the quiet man, waiting anxiously for the catch, but the moment never came. For the first time in a decade, shielded from the violent storm by a tired stranger's worn fleece, Victoria Sterling was completely, wonderfully invisible, realizing with shocking clarity that this quiet, undemanding anonymity was the greatest luxury she had experienced in years.
For the first hour, the heavy, suffocating silence that usually accompanied Victoria Sterling was entirely absent, replaced by a comfortable, ambient quiet that felt completely foreign to her highly calibrated life. The only sounds echoing through the empty, brightly lit diner were the relentless drumming of the storm against the foggy plate glass windows, the low hum of the ancient refrigerators, and the monotonous scrape of Arthur's paring knife against the plastic cutting board. Victoria sat rigidly on her worn vinyl stool, nursing the chipped ceramic mug of dark, bitter coffee, slowly allowing the biting chill to drain from her bones. She watched him covertly over the rim of her cup, her sharp eyes tracking his movements as he effortlessly transitioned from slicing lemons to refilling heavy syrup dispensers. In her world of aggressive, hostile takeovers and relentless public scrutiny, everyone always wanted something from her. Every interaction was a transaction, every smile a calculated maneuver designed to extract money, influence, or power. Yet this exhausted man in the stained apron was completely ignoring her in the most beautifully peaceful way imaginable. He wasn't staring, he wasn't sneaking photos, and he wasn't awkwardly attempting sycophantic small talk. He was simply letting her exist, allowing her the space to breathe without demanding a single piece of her soul in return. The absolute luxury of being treated like a completely ordinary human being was intoxicating, slowly melting the icy armor she had meticulously built around herself over the past decade. Eventually, the sheer anomaly of the situation became too much for her analytical mind to ignore. She lowered the coffee mug gently onto the laminate counter, the slight clink of the ceramic piercing the quiet atmosphere, and cleared her throat, her voice slightly raspy from the freezing rain. "You really don't know who I am, do you?" she asked, the question slipping out with a strange, unfamiliar vulnerability rather than her usual commanding arrogance. Arthur paused his diligent wiping, the damp rag resting motionless on the stainless steel, and looked up at her with a calm, appraising gaze. He took in her ruined emerald silk and the piercing intensity of her dark eyes, then simply offered a slight, easy shrug of his broad shoulders. "I know you're someone who had a really terrible night and ruined a spectacular dress," he replied, his low, gravelly baritone entirely devoid of sarcasm. Victoria let out a short, breathy laugh that surprised even her. "My name is Victoria Sterling. I run a multinational technology conglomerate. Usually when people look at me, they see a massive walking bank account, a stepping stone for their careers, or a morning headline." She waited for the inevitable widening of his eyes or the desperate realization of his missed opportunity. Instead, Arthur just picked up his rag again. "Well, Victoria Sterling, congratulations on the conglomerate," he said evenly, an incredibly subtle, warm amusement dancing in his exhausted eyes. "But in here, at 3 in the morning, you were just a customer at Eddie's Diner.
And honestly, I haven't watched the news or read a paper in about 3 years. The profound, heavy relief that washed over Victoria was completely overwhelming, a physical sensation that caused her tense, rigid shoulders to drop completely. Arthur leaned his elbows against the worn laminate, the harsh fluorescent lighting casting deep, bruised shadows over his exhausted features, and finally allowed a small, genuine smile to break through his stoic expression. He explained, his voice softening considerably, that the relentless, exhausting machinery of surviving the world left zero room for the luxury of keeping up with it. He painted a vivid, heartbreakingly simple picture of a life utterly consumed by a single powerful gravitational pull, his 7-year-old daughter, Mia. His entire existence, he confessed, was a precarious juggling act of double shifts and overdue rent, desperately trying to hide his bone-deep exhaustion behind a cheerful smile. He spoke with glowing, unfiltered pride about Mia's fierce obsession with the cosmos, detailing how their tiny apartment ceiling was plastered entirely with cheap glow-in-the-dark stars arranged into constellations. As he spoke, the oppressive exhaustion seemed to momentarily lift from his face, replaced with a radiant love that Victoria had never witnessed in her sterile world. In the face of his raw honesty, the impenetrable walls of her carefully constructed fortress began to crumble. Hesitantly, she found herself leaning forward, her voice dropping to an intimate whisper as she began to truly speak for the first time in her adult life. She told him about the crushing weight of endless expectations and the constant paranoid vigilance required to survive in a boardroom filled with opportunistic vultures. She described the deep, echoing emptiness of her sprawling penthouse, a place filled with priceless art but utterly devoid of warmth, laughter, or genuine human connection. "I have thousands of people who answer to me," Victoria whispered, a single tear threatening to spill over her pale cheek. "But I haven't had a real conversation with someone who didn't want something from me in over 10 years, until tonight." Arthur didn't offer empty platitudes. He simply reached across the laminate counter, his rough, calloused hand gently resting over her trembling fingers for a fleeting, anchoring second, forging a profound understanding rooted in their shared humanity. The relentless, hammering assault of the storm finally began to surrender to the slow, inevitable creep of dawn, the violent deluge tapering off into a gentle, rhythmic drizzle that softly tapped against the diner's foggy plate glass windows. Inside, the heavy, intimate spell that had enveloped the brightly lit, greasy sanctuary for the past 4 hours was slowly beginning to thin, threatened by the encroaching reality of the morning light. The harsh, blinking neon sign in the window, which had violently cast alternating slashes of crimson and blue across the laminate counter all night, finally buzzed and flickered out, leaving the diner bathed in the pale, slate-gray luminescence of the early morning. Victoria Sterling remained perched on her worn red vinyl stool, the oversized, grease-scented employee fleece still wrapped securely around her fragile frame, her fingers lightly tracing the chipped rim of her now empty coffee mug. The profound, breathless vulnerability she had shared with Arthur, the quiet confessions of her crushing loneliness, the mutual exchange of their deeply isolated realities, hung delicately in the stale, warm air between them, creating an invisible, powerful tether. She watched as Arthur moved with a renewed, mechanical efficiency, the brief respite of their conversation giving way to the demanding realities of his impending shift change. He was effortlessly balancing trays of heavy, thick ceramic mugs, brewing fresh vats of the bitter, dark roast coffee, and arranging rows of freshly baked, artificial-looking cherry pastries in the glass display case. Every movement he made was grounded, purposeful, and entirely unpretentious. For Victoria, the encroaching daylight brought a familiar, suffocating knot of dread forming in the pit of her stomach. The beautiful, suspended animation of the graveyard shift was ending, and with the rising sun came the terrifying, inevitable return to her high-stakes empire. She didn't want to leave the sticky laminate counter. She didn't want to trade the honest simplicity of this exhausted father's company for a boardroom full of calculated smiles and ruthless agendas. She wanted to stay hidden in the protective, anonymous warmth of Eddie's 24-hour diner forever. The fragile, quiet bubble of their shared isolation was violently, irreversibly shattered by the sudden, deafening roar of high-performance engines tearing into the diner's flooded parking lot. The blinding, aggressive sweep of heavy-duty headlights slashed violently through the foggy front windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the stale air and completely destroying the gentle, gray peace of the dawn. Almost instantly, the heavy glass door was violently thrown open, the brass chimes shrieking in protest as three broad-shouldered men in immaculately tailored, soaked charcoal suits burst into the tiny establishment, their eyes frantically scanning the room with aggressive, trained precision. Behind them, a frantic, pale young woman clutching a glowing tablet practically sprinted through the entryway, her heels clicking frantically against the checkered linoleum. "Miss Sterling, oh my God, we've been searching the entire grid for hours. The Maybach's tracker went offline in the flood," the assistant gasped, her voice shrill and trembling with absolute panic as she rushed toward the counter, desperately attempting to drape a pristine, dry cashmere trench coat over her boss's shoulders. The stark, jarring collision of Victoria's hyper-managed elite reality violently invading Arthur's humble, run-down sanctuary was incredibly jarring. In an instant, the soft, vulnerable woman who had just spent hours quietly mourning the emptiness of her life vanished, aggressively replaced by the terrifying, impenetrable titan of industry. Victoria's spine snapped completely straight, her jaw clenching tightly as the familiar, heavy armor of her ruthless CEO persona instinctively locked firmly back into place. She allowed the frantic assistant to gently pull the oversized, faded gray fleece from her shoulders, the sudden loss of Arthur's makeshift blanket leaving her feeling incredibly cold, despite the expensive cashmere now draped over her. She watched out of the corner of her eye as Arthur instinctively took a slow, deliberate step backward, retreating quietly into the shadows of the espresso machines, instantly recognizing the unbridgeable, massive chasm of wealth, power, and status that had violently opened up between them. He was no longer her confidant. He was just a nameless, faceless employee respectfully clearing the stage for the billionaire's grand exit. Victoria stood up from the squeaking vinyl stool, her ruined, muddy emerald silk gown pooling heavily beneath the immaculate hem of the cashmere coat. Her security team immediately formed a tight, protective phalanx around her, aggressively directing her toward the waiting fleet of armored SUVs idling loudly in the rain-slicked parking lot. She took 3 confident, commanding steps toward the glass door, her ruined heels sharply clicking on the linoleum, fully prepared to march back into the suffocating, luxurious prison of her daily existence. But right as a massive bodyguard reached out to push the heavy glass door open, she froze in her tracks. The frantic, swirling chaos of her entourage seemed to momentarily mute itself as she turned her head, her dark eyes desperately seeking out Arthur one last time. He was standing quietly by the register, a fresh, damp rag already in his hand, offering her a small, deeply understanding and heartbreakingly weary smile. She couldn't leave. Not like this. Ignoring the confused, panicked protests of her assistant and the rigid tension of her security detail, Victoria turned around completely and walked slowly back to the sticky laminate counter. She reached into the pocket of the cashmere coat, discreetly sliding a crisp, folded $100 bill under her empty coffee saucer, a ridiculous, inadequate gesture, but the only currency her world understood. She looked directly into Arthur's incredibly tired, remarkably kind eyes, completely ignoring the stunned silence of her team hovering nervously a few feet away. "Arthur," she said, her commanding voice dropping into a quiet, deeply intimate register meant exclusively for him, carrying the last trace of the vulnerability they had shared. "What was the best part of your night?" She fully expected him to gesture to the massive tip hidden under the plate, or perhaps offer a polite, generic comment about the excitement of meeting a public figure. Instead, Arthur stopped wiping the counter, leaning in slightly. The weary, genuine smile never left his face. "Honestly," he replied, his low baritone vibrating with absolute, unfiltered sincerity, "having a quiet conversation with someone who didn't ask me to fix their toy or pour them a juice box. It was really nice just being a person with you." The profound, breathless simplicity of his words struck her with the force of a physical blow, breaking completely through her carefully reconstructed armor. She held his gaze for one long, silent second, nodding once, before turning and walking out into the blinding morning light. Exactly 1 week had passed since the violent storm and the surreal, impossible night that followed, and Arthur had finally managed to successfully convince himself that the entire encounter had simply been an elaborate, desperately detailed hallucination brought on by chronic sleep deprivation and the hypnotic drumming of the freezing rain. His life had instantly and violently snapped back into its grueling, unforgiving rhythm, a relentless cycle of wiping down the sticky laminate counter, serving burned coffee to exhausted truck drivers, and rushing back across the city to a cramped apartment to help his fiercely bright 7-year-old daughter, Mia, navigate the complexities of third-grade mathematics. The massive, crisp $100 bill Victoria Sterling had discreetly slipped beneath her ceramic saucer remained meticulously folded and safely tucked away in a battered tin coffee can above Arthur's tiny stove, feeling more like a piece of strange counterfeit evidence from a fever dream than actual spendable currency. It was a chaotic, deafening Tuesday afternoon, completely devoid of the intimate, suspended quiet of the graveyard shift, and Arthur was pushing through the brutal final hour of an exhausting double shift. The diner was a suffocating cacophony of clattering silverware, sizzling grease from the flat-top grill, and the loud, overlapping conversations of the dense lunchtime rush. He was mechanically wiping down a recently vacated booth, his muscles screaming in dull, familiar protest, his mind entirely focused on the fact that he was only 30 minutes away from taking off his stained apron and walking to Mia's elementary school to pick her up. He didn't have the mental capacity or the emotional bandwidth to entertain the lingering, quiet memory of the billionaire who had briefly sought refuge in his oversized fleece jacket. She belonged to a completely different universe, a glittering, inaccessible stratosphere that hovered millions of miles above his mundane, exhausting reality. But just as he turned around with a heavy plastic bus tub full of dirty, stacked porcelain plates and half-eaten sandwiches, the familiar, harsh jingle of the brass door chime managed to completely pierce through the dense, loud atmosphere of the busy diner, freezing Arthur entirely in his tracks. Standing in the brightly lit entryway, bathed in the warm, golden light of the afternoon sun, was Victoria, but this time she was completely devoid of the imposing, aggressive armor of her corporate empire. The ruined, expensive emerald silk, the immaculate cashmere trench coat, and the frantic, suffocating entourage of heavily armed security guards were entirely gone. Instead, the ruthless, internationally feared titan of modern industry was dressed in a soft, oversized, cream-colored knit sweater, a simple pair of well-worn blue denim jeans, and comfortable white sneakers, her dark hair falling in soft, natural waves around her shoulders, rather than being pulled into a severe, intimidating updo. She looked incredibly, remarkably ordinary, yet somehow, to Arthur, she appeared infinitely more radiant and striking than she had when draped in millions of dollars of exclusive haute couture. The daytime waitstaff, frantically carrying trays of burgers and milkshakes, and the busy, chattering customers barely spared her a second glance, utterly failing to recognize the famously impenetrable CEO without her signature icy glare and her aggressive phalanx of handlers. She was holding a massive, beautifully bound, heavily illustrated encyclopedia of the solar system tightly against her chest, the glossy cover catching the harsh fluorescent lights of the diner. She didn't hesitate or nervously scan the crowded room, her dark, piercing eyes instantly locked onto Arthur, who was standing completely paralyzed behind the counter, a tray of dirty dishes balanced precariously on his aching shoulder, his jaw slightly slack in utter, unadulterated disbelief. Victoria navigated gracefully through the tight, chaotic maze of crowded vinyl booths, high chairs, and squeaking floorboards with a quiet, confident grace, completely ignoring the overwhelming symphony of the diner, until she reached the empty stool directly across from where Arthur had retreated to at the cash register. She slid seamlessly onto the squeaking red vinyl, placing the heavy, beautiful book gently onto the sticky laminate counter, a warm, completely genuine and uncharacteristically nervous smile slowly breaking across her face as Arthur finally managed to lower the heavy tray onto the stainless steel sink and walk slowly over to her, his heart suddenly hammering a frantic, impossibly loud rhythm against his ribs. The deafening noise of the busy diner seemed to immediately fade into a muted, irrelevant background hum, recreating the intimate, isolated bubble they had shared a week prior in the dead of night. He wiped his trembling hands nervously on his stained, coffee-scented apron, completely at a loss for words, half expecting her manicured entourage to suddenly burst through the glass doors at any second and violently pull her back into her untouchable, sterile world of boardrooms and private jets. But the doors remained firmly shut, and Victoria remained seated, her eyes remarkably soft, vulnerable, and entirely focused on him. "My car is running perfectly fine today," Victoria said softly, her clear, melodic voice cutting effortlessly through the remaining noise of the clattering diner, carrying that exact same intimate, vulnerable frequency she had used a week prior in the dead of night. Arthur just stared at her, a profound sense of awe washing over his exhausted features. "I spent the last 7 days sitting in endless, suffocating board meetings, flying across the country on private jets, and attending incredibly loud, incredibly crowded philanthropic galas. And the first time in a decade, I realized just how incredibly cold and deeply empty my world really is. I realized that the only time I have felt truly awake, truly visible, and truly warm in years was when I was sitting right here, drinking absolutely terrible coffee and listening to you talk about glow-in-the-dark stars." She slowly slid the massive, heavy encyclopedia across the laminate counter until the glossy edge gently bumped against Arthur's rough, calloused hands. She reached out, her soft, pale fingers lightly and deliberately brushing against his bruised knuckles, sending a sudden electric jolt of warmth straight through his exhausted, overworked body. "I canceled my afternoon meetings, and I bought this," Victoria whispered, her dark eyes shining with a fierce, terrified, but incredibly hopeful determination as she looked up into his stunned, weary face. "I was hoping that maybe, if you're not too tired, I could finally meet Mia, and I was really hoping that I could be the best part of your day too." Did this story warm your heart? If you love emotional, inspiring tales about unlikely connections and second chances, make sure to hit that subscribe button.